This document you sent, it's really fascinating. It's all about culture and missions. And it kind of sparked a memory for me. This was back when I was in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, and it's a beautiful place. Anyway, I was with some local Christians. We were having this great meal together. Everything was delicious. But then they brought out this meat dish. Everyone was like, oh, you got to try this. So naturally I did, took a bite, and wow, it was spicy. I mean, I like spicy food, but this was something else. Really intense flavor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But it was good. It was really good. Anyway, I ate what I could.
Good.
But later on, I found out it was dog meat.
Oh, wow. That is a surprise. I mean, I know it's eaten in some cultures, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It just goes to show how culture shapes even our most basic perceptions, like what we consider food. It's these hidden lenses we all wear. And that brings us to the topic of our deep dive today, the concept of culture, especially as it relates to missions.
Right. The idea is to really unpack what culture is, based on the sources you've shared with us, to understand what it means, how it works, and what implications it has, especially when we're talking about interacting with people from different cultures.
Absolutely. And to guide us through all of this, we have our expert here who can, well, shed some light on all of this.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is culture, according to what you've been reading?
Well, the first thing to point out is that the sources make this distinction between how we popularly understand culture and the more technical anthropological definition. We often think of culture as like the arts or refined manners being cultured. But the technical definition, it goes deeper. It goes back to the Latin roots of the word, like colere, which means to cultivate or instruct, and cultus, meaning cultivation or training.
Okay, so it's not just about knowing your operas.
No, not exactly. The anthropological view sees culture as this: totality of human learned accumulated experience. And this experience, it's transmitted socially within a specific group. The source also describes it as the shared and integrated patterns of behavior exhibited by a particular group. So it's everything we learn and pass on within our societies.
That's a pretty broad definition.
It is, but the sources help us grasp it better by using some analogies. They talk about culture as an organism, for example.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. How does that work?
Well, just like a living organism, culture is this integrated system. It's made up of ideas, values, plans, actions, feelings, and each part, it contributes to the whole, and they all influence each other. It's like you can't understand one aspect of a culture without understanding how it connects to the other aspects.
I see. So it's like a living, breathing thing.
Exactly. And there's another analogy. Culture as a map. This one's from Paul Hibert. He describes culture as this integrated system, again, that word of ideas, feelings, values, and then the behaviors and products that come from those. He says it's shared by a group of people who use the system to organize and regulate what they think, feel, and do.
It's a powerful way of putting it. It's like culture is a map that guides people within a society.
Yeah, it tells them what to do, how to act, like which side of the road to drive on, or how to greet someone properly, stuff that seems basic.
Right.
But it's deeply rooted in culture.
Right. And the sources use some interesting examples to illustrate this, like eating and marriage. They point out that everyone needs to eat, right? And marriage, it exists in some form across many cultures.
Yeah.
But the way we eat, the way we marry, that's all culturally determined.
It reminds me of that dog meat again.
Exactly. That's a great example.
That's good.
It's all about what is considered acceptable to eat. The sources also talk about the different forms of marriage that exist around the world, like arranged marriages versus love marriages. So culture dictates these specific ways of satisfying our basic human needs.
Interesting. Now, the source also breaks down culture into its different components. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. It's important to remember that while culture is this integrated whole, it's also made up of these building blocks, I guess you could say, and these components. They help us understand how cultures are similar and how they're different. The source uses this phrase, a way of life. Basically, culture is how a society adapts to its environment. And this environment, it's not just the physical stuff, but also social and ideological.
Ah, so different aspects of the environment. Can you give some examples?
Absolutely. When it comes to the physical environment, the source talks about housing. Like in some parts of Nigeria, you see round houses, while in Kalimantan, the houses are long and narrow. The source explains that these architectural styles, they're often adaptations to things like climate, available materials, even social structures. Pretty interesting, right?
Yeah, it is. What about the social environment? So the social environment, this is all about how people relate to each other within a culture. It includes things like political systems, economic practices, kinship rules, communication styles. The source contrasts the rigid social classes of the Inca Empire with the more fluid social structure of Japan, really highlights how different cultures can be.
I see. And then there's the ideological environment. What does that include?
Right. This is about the ideas, beliefs, and values that shape a culture's worldview. It includes things like knowledge systems, art, magic, religion, philosophy, science. The source gives this example of North Americans relying on fertilizer for agriculture, while Melanesians depend on manna, this spiritual force. Shows how different cultures understand and interact with the world around them.
So culture is this toolkit that helps us navigate these different environments. And like you said, it's a way of life. But the source also emphasizes that it's just one way among many, which brings us to this idea of cultural relativity. Can you explain that a bit further?
Yeah, cultural relativity. It's a key principle in anthropology. It basically means that we can't judge other cultures based on our own cultural values. What's considered right or wrong, good or bad? It really depends on the context of that specific culture.
So just because I prefer one way of doing things doesn't make it better than another way.
Right. Like the source uses the example of inheritance patterns. Some cultures are patrilineal, meaning inheritance goes through the male line. Others are matrilineal. Neither is inherently better or worse. They just serve different needs within their respective societies.
But the source also makes a distinction between cultural relativity and ethical relativity.
Right, exactly. And it's an important distinction. Cultural relativity doesn't mean that everything is morally acceptable just because a culture practices it. The source uses the example of child sacrifice. It's culturally embedded in some societies, but that doesn't make it ethically right.
Right, that makes sense. And isn't the opposite of cultural relativity ethnocentrism?
It is. Ethnocentrism is that tendency to view our own culture as superior and judge other cultures based on our own standards. It's like thinking our way is the only right way. And cultural relativity helps us to counter that.
So we've talked about what culture is, its components, and this idea of cultural relativity. The source also talks about culture as an integrated system. Can you unpack that a little?
Sure. This goes back to the analogy of culture as an organism or machine. The idea is that all the different parts of a culture are interconnected and work together. So if you change one part, it can affect the whole system.
Yeah, the example of the Kapauku in Irian Jaya really stuck with me.
Oh, yes. The pig-centered culture.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So for the Kapauku, pigs are super important. I mean, they're a source of food, obviously, but they're also connected to prestige, wealth, even political power. To raise more pigs, you need more sweet potatoes, which means more gardens tended by women. And having more women, well, that requires wealth to compensate them. It's this whole interconnected web all centered around pigs.
It's amazing how one element can be so central to so many aspects of life. And the source mentions another example, this one a bit more cautionary. The introduction of the steel axe in an Australian Aboriginal culture.
Yes, Lauriston Sharp's work. He studied how this seemingly simple technological change completely disrupted the social fabric of that society. The steel axe. It was more efficient than their traditional stone axes. But it upset the balance of their social structures, labor divisions, even their spiritual beliefs. It led to, societal disintegration. It's a powerful example of how interconnected everything is within a culture.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. Now, another important characteristic of culture is that it's learned, not innate. What does the source say about this?
Right. This is really important, especially for missions. The sources emphasize that culture is something we acquire through socialization. It's not something we're born with. We learn it from our families, our communities, our environment.
So it's nurture, not nature.
Exactly. And the source uses the example of a child born to Japanese parents but raised in Mexico. That child, despite their genes, will grow up speaking Spanish, eating Mexican food, and embracing Mexican values. They'll be Mexican, culturally speaking.
That makes perfect sense. And there's that other example from Hybert about floor cleanliness.
Oh, right. How North Americans and Japanese people view cleanliness differently is fascinating.
It is. Tell us about it.
Well, in North America, we tend to think of the floor as dirty, so we wear shoes inside and we avoid sitting directly on the floor. But in Japan, it's the opposite. They take off their shoes before entering a home and often sit or sleep on the floor. It's just a different cultural norm. And it shows how these learned behaviors can become so deeply ingrained, we don't even think about them. They just feel natural.
That's so true. And the source concludes that culture is basically the socially acquired part of our environment.
Yeah.
And it's transmitted through teaching.
Yeah. And it's this ability to learn and transmit culture that sets humans apart from other species. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've defined culture, looked at its components, talked about cultural relativity. But there's another aspect we need to address: the symbolic nature of culture.
Yes, how culture is full of symbols.
Exactly. Many anthropologists believe that human behavior, it's deeply rooted in symbols. They say symbols are how we make sense of the world, how we communicate, how we create meaning.
And what exactly is a symbol in this context?
A symbol is basically anything that stands for something else. It could be a word, a gesture, an object, a ritual. The key is that it has a specific meaning attached to it. And this meaning, it's not inherent in the symbol itself, it's assigned by the culture.
I remember the example from the source about sticking out your tongue.
Right, that's a great one.
Ah,
In North America, sticking out your tongue usually means you're being rude or mocking someone, but in Tibet, it's a way of greeting people. The same gesture, completely different meaning. It all depends on the cultural context. Right. And the biggest example of a symbolic system is language itself. Words are symbols. They represent things, ideas, actions, and we learn to use these symbols through culture.
And there are so many other examples. Like flags, they represent nations. Clothing, it can symbolize social status, religious beliefs, even personal style. And gestures, like touching someone's head, can have positive or negative connotations depending on the culture.
Exactly. And misinterpreting these symbols, it can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings, especially in cross-cultural interactions. Okay, one last characteristic of culture we need to talk about is that it's dynamic and adaptive.
It's always changing, always evolving.
Exactly. Cultures aren't static. They change over time to adapt to new environments, new challenges, new ideas. And the sources point out that this ability to adapt is crucial for a society's survival.
Earlier, we talked about how housing styles can be adaptations to the physical environment. Can you give some other examples?
Sure. The source talks about how cultures in arid regions have developed specific practices for conserving water, for example, and cultures in areas with abundant rainfall might have elaborate irrigation systems for rice cultivation.
So it's all about adjusting to the physical realities.
Right. But it's not just about physical adaptation. Cultures also adapt to ideological factors, like whether a society's worldview is more scientific or spiritual. That's going to shape a lot of their beliefs and practices.
Makes sense. And while cultures are constantly adapting, they also maintain a certain degree of stability, right?
Yes, that's true. Cultures need to find this balance between continuity and change. They need to preserve their traditions and values while also adapting to new circumstances. The source gives the example of the automobile's impact on North American society. It was this huge technological innovation that completely changed the way people lived and interacted, and it forced culture to adapt.
So it's this constant dance between staying the same and changing with the times.
Yeah.
Exactly, and ultimately the source argues that a society's survival depends on its ability to maintain a healthy relationship with its environment, both the physical and the ideological.
And culture is the tool that allows them to do that. Okay, we've covered a lot about culture itself, but the source material you sent me, it really focuses on the implications of all of this for cross-cultural work, especially missions. So how does understanding culture impact that field?
This is where it gets really interesting. The source makes this point. Anyone working across cultures, especially missionaries, they need to understand and adapt to the cultural realities of the people they're serving.
That makes sense. You can't just go in with your own cultural assumptions and expect everything to work the same way.
Right. And the source stresses that this adaptation needs to happen on multiple levels: in the missionary's personal lifestyle, how they communicate the message, the way churches are established, even the way Christian life is expressed in that new context.
And if they don't adapt, what can happen? The source mentions culture shock.
Yeah, culture shock. It's a real thing. It's basically this negative reaction to a different culture. And it happens when someone's exposed to new and unfamiliar cultural experiences and demands. It can be really disorienting.
What are some of the symptoms of culture shock?
Well, the source talks about these unhealthy responses to culture shock. There's the tourist response, where everything is new and exciting at first, but then the novelty wears off and the person starts to see only the negative aspects of the culture. They might get homesick, even hostile towards the host culture.
It's like a honeymoon phase that turns sour.
Exactly. And then there's the rejection response, where the person just rejects the new culture outright. They cling to their own culture and refuse to adapt. And even if they manage to tolerate the new culture, it's without any genuine acceptance or affection.
So simply enduring isn't enough.
No, it's not. The source argues that the healthy way to adjust is through accommodation. And this involves genuinely accepting the new culture, its ways of life, its values. It starts with respect, not just understanding the culture, but appreciating it. and learning to behave in a way that's appropriate to that culture.
And this respect. It shouldn't compromise biblical teachings, right?
Right, exactly. It's about finding that balance. The source highlights this concept of identification, where the missionary really immerses themselves in the culture. They live with the people, share their experiences, participate in their customs, and they do all of this without compromising their faith.
It's about becoming one with the people you're serving.
Mm-hmm.
But the source makes a distinction between identification and going native, right?
Yes, it's an important distinction, identification. It's about loving and serving the people, and it comes from a genuine desire to introduce them to Christ. Going native, on the other hand, it might be more superficial, it might be driven by personal gain or curiosity, without a real commitment to the people.
So it's about the heart behind it.
Exactly. And the source also talks about adjusting the message, the church, and the expression of Christian life to the receptor culture. This is what's known as accommodation or contextualization.
Yeah, I was really interested in that part. Can you explain it a bit further?
Sure. The basic idea is that just as individuals need to adapt, so does the way we communicate the gospel and the way the church functions. We need to make sure it's relevant and understandable to the people in that culture.
The source quotes Louis Luzbetak, who says that the biggest mistake is not accommodating at all. Why is that?
Because if we don't accommodate, we risk making the gospel inaccessible to people. It might sound foreign, even irrelevant to their lives. For example, the source talks about how Western sermon structures, they might not work in cultures where communication is more circular, less linear. So we need to adapt our methods.
And this applies to the church structure as well, right?
Absolutely. Churches in different cultures might have different ways of making decisions, organizing themselves, worshiping, and that's okay, as long as it doesn't contradict biblical principles.
So it's about finding ways to express the Christian faith that resonate with the local culture.
Exactly. And the source goes on to outline some key principles for successful accommodation. One of the most important is faithfulness to the biblical foundation.
Obviously, we can't compromise the core message of the gospel.
Right. But we also shouldn't elevate our own cultural practices to the same level as Scripture. The source emphasizes that the Bible alone should be the foundation for Christianity in any culture.
Another principle is avoiding syncretism. Can you explain that?
Syncretism. It's basically mixing different religions or belief systems together, creating something new that isn't really either of the originals. And the source warns against doing that with Christianity. We can't blend the gospel with local myths or rituals in a way that distorts the core message.
So we need to be careful about how we incorporate cultural elements.
Yes. The source clarifies that using local cultural forms to express Christian ideas, that's not necessarily syncretism. It's about finding ways to communicate the message in a way that's meaningful to the people. But we have to make sure the underlying theology is still biblical.
That makes sense. What are some other principles for effective accommodation?
Well, the source talks about the importance of expressing the Christian message in a way that's relevant and understandable to the people. This involves understanding their language, their thought patterns, their cultural values. It's about finding that sweet spot where the message connects with their hearts and minds.
And it's not just about translating the words, right? It's about conveying the meaning behind them.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes the importance of communicating from the audience's perspective, not just our own. We need to understand their needs, their questions, their worldview.
So it's really about putting ourselves in their shoes.
Right. And finally, a key principle is empowering the local people to express their faith in their own terms. It's not about us imposing our culture on them. It's about helping them to understand and live out the gospel in a way that's authentic to their own culture.
That's a beautiful vision. And the source also talks about this concept of the indigenous or dynamic equivalent church.
Yes, the idea is that the church in each culture should reflect the values and practices of that culture. While staying true to Scripture, of course, it's about creating a church that feels organic to the people.
So it's not about copying the Western church model.
Right. The worship style, the leadership structure, the way they meet and interact, it should all resonate with the local culture.
And just like with the message, we need to make sure we're not imposing unnecessary cultural elements from our own background.
Exactly. There might be certain things that are important in our culture, like dress codes or certain activities, but they might not be relevant or necessary in another culture.
So it's about being sensitive and discerning. Now, the source goes on to outline several different methods of accommodation. Can you give us an overview?
Sure. It talks about methods like transformation, possessio, felt need power, and counterfunctional substitute, and dynamic equivalence in each of these approaches. It offers a different way of thinking about how to contextualize the gospel and the church.
Can you elaborate on one or two of those methods, maybe starting with possessio, because that one sounds
Okay,
interesting.
possessio. It's an approach advocated by Peter Byerhouse, and it's based on this idea that God is the ultimate owner of all things. So we can, in a sense, reclaim aspects of culture for his purposes. Byerhouse talks about a three-step process. First, you select cultural elements that align with biblical truth. Then, you reject any unchristian meanings or practices associated with those elements. And finally, you reinterpret them. You infuse them with a new Christian meaning.
I see. So it's about taking something that already exists and giving it a new purpose.
Exactly. And the source gives the example of Paul using the term regeneration in the New Testament. It was a term used in Hellenistic mystery religions, but Paul took it and gave it a new Christian meaning, referring to spiritual rebirth.
It's fascinating how he used existing language to communicate new ideas.
Yeah.
But the source cautions against just blindly adopting cultural elements, right?
Yes, that's crucial. Bayerhouse stresses the importance of rejecting any unchristian aspects before reinterpreting something. Okay, another method the source describes is the felt need, power encounter, functional substitute approach.
And that one's from Ellen Tippett, right?
It is. And it starts by identifying the felt needs of the people. What are their deepest desires, their fears, their hopes? Then there's a power encounter, which it marks a break with the old ways. It could be a conversion experience, a healing, something that demonstrates the power of God. And finally, you provide a functional substitute. This is a new Christian practice or belief that meets that same felt need in a culturally appropriate way.
I like that. It's about meeting people where they are, but also offering them something new and better.
Exactly. The source gives this example of a Javanese farmer who traditionally sacrifices to field spirits for a good harvest. When they become Christian, they stop the sacrifices, but they still need a way to seek God's blessing on their crops. So they might start praying and dedicating their fields to God instead. It's a functional substitute.
It's about finding new ways to express their faith. And the source concludes by offering some key questions to consider when evaluating any accommodation method. Can you share those with us?
Yeah, these questions, they're really helpful for discerning whether an approach is appropriate or not. They ask things like, is this change necessary for a biblical expression of Christianity? Is it consistent with biblical teachings? Does it lead to a biblical way of life? Are the local people involved in the process? Are there safeguards against reverting to old ways? And finally, does it lead to church growth?
Those are some great questions to ask. So to wrap up our deep dive, can you summarize the key takeaways about culture and its implications, especially for those involved in cross-cultural missions?
The main takeaway is that culture is this deeply ingrained system that shapes our thoughts, our behaviors, our values, and understanding culture, both our own and the cultures of others. It's essential for effective cross-cultural work, especially in missions. The source emphasizes the importance of adapting to new cultures, being sensitive to their ways of life, and finding ways to communicate the gospel and establish the church in a way that's both biblical and culturally relevant.
It's been such an enlightening conversation. And for you, our listener, I want to leave you with this thought. Think about your own cultural assumptions. What are some things that you consider normal or right that might be perceived very differently in another part of the world? It's something to ponder as you continue to learn and grow in your understanding of other cultures. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.